This is Jim Goodnow reporting to Radio for Peace from Washington, D.C. I'm at the home of Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel, do you have something to say on your background for us?
I have a background that makes me feel, as I watch the bombing of Serbia, that this is where I came in. I joined the Defense Department as a full-time employee at GS-18, highest civil service grade. In 1965, actually in 1964, but by the spring of 1965, a few months later, of course, we were bombing North Vietnam on pretty much the same kind of campaign that we're conducting right now against Serbia and Kosovo. Subsequently, I switched to the State Department, volunteered to go to Vietnam as an FSR-1, where I evaluated pacification for the embassy for a couple of years. Was all over Vietnam in a counterinsurgency campaign that, ironically, was closer to that of the other side in the Kosovo conflict right now, quite similar to that Slobodan Milosevic was conducting against the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. We were conducting a very similar kind of operation against the NLF, the National Liberation Front. And our excuse then was, as Slobodan Milosevic's has been now, that we were facing a movement that was using terrorism to some extent. But of course, in the course of repressing that, we multiplied the attacks on civilians that could be attributed to the other side by a very large factor. We killed far more civilians than we ever accused the NLF of having targeted. Before very long, in fact. And at the same time, of course, we were carrying on the kind of bombing campaign with its civilian casualties that the U.S. is again doing against Serbia. I knew in the Pentagon within weeks of the onset of that bombing 34 years ago that it was hopeless in terms of an ability to achieve our goals in Vietnam. And the question we faced then was whether then to modify those goals and effectively to withdraw, or to double the bet and send ground troops. It's the same kind of choice we're facing now. And in that time, of course, we made the wrong choice very much and sent a ground invasion force, which could still happen, I'm afraid, in the case of Kosovo. And I think with no greater real success. I believe if we went into Kosovo now, we would, or Serbia, even worse, we would face an endless guerrilla war, as the Germans faced in the Second World War, with mounting casualties and with greater devastation to the country and to civilians even than is being inflicted now. So I'm very concerned to head off an invasion. Now, to say that we have there's an even stronger reason, I think, than that for opposing an invasion, because we're facing something, I think, in Kosovo that we did not face in Vietnam, and indeed is almost unprecedented in conflicts, and that is that our opponent, Slobodan Milosevic, holds essentially as hostage over 1 million Kosovar Albanians who, despite our bombing, are still totally in the control of his ground forces. He has shown a ruthlessness in dealing with those people that I think would lead him to treat them as expendable hostages. And in the event of an invasion prospect, I think he would be prepared to use them effectively as human shields. We would be shot at, I believe, from buildings in towns like Pristina or even smaller towns, from buildings that were filled with Albanian Muslims, civilians, mainly women and children. And we would have to face the choice of whether to forge ahead and or to back off. But if we bombed them or shelled them, we would be ourselves massacring the very people that we purport to be protecting. In other wars, we've killed civilians in large numbers with the excuse that there were larger interests, global security interests that were at stake, as in World War II, that justified our inflicting great, what we called collateral damage, or even direct attacks on civilians. In this case, we're not claiming there are any larger interests than the protection of the Kosovars. There are other interests at stake. We're not acknowledging them. And those other interests might, like producing a victory for NATO, or saving face for our own officials, might indeed lead us to move ahead, both in the bombing of Serbia and possibly in an invasion, at the cost of the lives of the Kosovars. But our public declared policy is different. It is to protect those very people. And I would not like to believe that my country would really participate in their destruction in order to save face, or to save NATO's face, for NATO credibility. I don't count on our government to refrain from that. So it's up to a popular movement in this country, working through Congress, I think, to assure that that doesn't happen. There is an alternative, either to invading or continuing the bombing further, or to withdrawing entirely on Milosevic's terms and leaving the Albanians in Kosovo to the mercies of Milosevic, have already shown to be not very tender-hearted. And that is a negotiated solution in which both sides would make significant concessions from their present position. Milosevic is demanding that there be no armed forces as a international force protecting Kosovars anywhere in Kosovo. He can't get the war over with that. The bombing will continue, or he'll be faced with invasion. If he holds to that, I think indefinitely. The U.S., on the other hand, is still demanding that NATO forces be allowed anywhere and everywhere in Kosovo, including the northern parts that are of the greatest historic and cultural significance to the Serbians. We can't get that by agreement. And if we got it by invasion, it would be at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Albanian lives. And I believe the cost of a pretty endless war. It would not bring peace. I don't think, in short, the Serbs will accept ever, without fighting, the total loss of their sovereignty over, in particular, the northern parts of Kosovo. But, as I say, realistically, I think there is a possibility for major compromise on each side here. The Russians are proposing an international peacekeeping force, which they now accept would be armed, well armed, to protect the Kosovars from Serb military or paramilitary operations. And that could be throughout Kosovo. That would, I think, end the fighting, and it might be acceptable to the Serbs in that they would count on the Russians not supporting or bringing about the total independence, say, of northern Kosovo. So they might accept that as a solution. If, by the way, the U.S. insisted on some U.S. or NATO forces, which I think is less desirable, but if they will not stop fighting for face-saving reasons, without getting some NATO forces in there, it seems possible to me that the Serbs could agree to NATO forces occupying as peacekeeping forces the southern parts of Kosovo, while the non-NATO forces and the Russians occupying the northern parts. That would be a kind of de facto partition. I think that, again, as I say, without going into much detail, that certainly involves a compromise, a come down from what Clinton is now asking, or NATO is now asking, and from what Milosevic is offering. It would be a concession by him. But it seems to me possible. Basically, in either case, in one case it's a partition, and in the other case a Russian protection force, or a force composed of people not now bombing Kosovo, which could include even NATO members such as the Greeks or Italians. I don't think they would be happy to see the Turks back in Kosovo, or the Albanians would be happy to see that. We could, in other words, solve this the way that that Vietnam could have been ended month by month or year by year, short of the 10 years that we fought there between 65 and 75. We were never before, and in that occasion, willing to recognize that we had no military way of bringing about what we demanded. And in fact, there was no way at all to do that, only a compromise, which in that case, I think would have given the other side most of what it wanted, was a way out of that war. That certainly would have been better for everyone had we done that. I think McNamara is acknowledging that now, having been Secretary of Defense at the time. Now, McNamara was one of those, I was working under him, of course, who saw very early in 65 that the bombing was essentially a hopeless and useless strategy, the bombing of the North. And yet refrained from telling the public that, or telling the Congress that, and instead, as I say, going along with measures that even deepened our involvement. I did that myself in terms of keeping my mouth shut too long. I think that if I had told what I knew about the prospects, the bad prospects for military action, the over-ambition of our objectives, and in some cases illegitimacy of our objectives in Vietnam. Had I done that in 64 or early 65, the whole war might have been prevented. So I have to share and feel responsible for that in a way that's hard to bear. I did eventually tell what I knew to Congress and give the documents to back it up, the so-called Pentagon Papers, 7,000 pages of top-secret documentation, showing the illegitimacy and the lies and the crimes, really, that were being committed by the U.S. up till then. And that did ultimately play some role in helping to shorten the war. I have no doubt at all that there are people in the Pentagon right now who are aware that our current policy is hopeless. Indeed, there have been a number of leaks on this occasion, much sooner than in the case of Vietnam, that perhaps some people learned from Vietnam in this respect. But there have been a lot of leaks to the newspapers that President Clinton was warned of exactly this before he chose to go ahead. And that does indeed raise very serious questions how it was he could have done it. But then no different from Lyndon Johnson, let's say, who also had been warned in quite realistic terms of what he would be getting into in Vietnam, but he chose to go ahead. In this case, I would urge the people who not only believed that and know now that they were right, but who also know what planning is going on for escalation of the war, and know how hopeless and dangerous that would be. I would urge them not to wait as long as I did to put out that information to Congress, even if they feel that it certainly would end their careers, probably. But these are patriotic, courageous people, and if they face the real alternatives, I'm sure I'm certain they are capable of sacrificing their careers. These are people in uniformed cases who have often faced the prospect of losing their lives for their country. In this case, what is being asked of them is that they jeopardize their career. I do not agree with Senator McCain on his proposal for ground forces there, but I do agree with the pressure that he's putting on for Congress to take a stand on the issue and to stand up and vote on the issue directly. And he does say that it is an issue for Congress to decide. And he said very well, I thought, the other day, that people who are unwilling to risk their political careers on this issue should not be risking other people's lives. Well said. And likewise, I would say the same to colonels and captains and generals in the Pentagon and civilians in the Pentagon, who know that the public is being misled as to what the planning is, to what the estimates are. And I'll just say that I feel sure of that without special knowledge or inside knowledge, just from my knowledge of governments, and this government, and of wars like this over the years. I take it for granted that this government, like every other government in this situation, is in some important respects lying to the public about what it expects, what it's planning, what it's doing. That's a constant. What should not be constant is the degree of obedience that they get and compliance from people doing that planning. And again, so I would urge such people not to wait till the troops are involved in combat, but to tell the truth to Congress right now with documents. I said they might risk their career or lose their career. They might go to jail, considerably. Certainly I was put on trial, facing 115 years in prison for what I did. But as soon as I saw the challenge to me to tell the truth and the reality that it could save lives, I must say I didn't hesitate. And I wouldn't expect other people to hesitate and shrink from that once they recognized where their true loyalties should lie and what their real obligations are as citizens of a democracy. Being a good American is not the same as the definition of a good German in the 30s or a good Russian under Stalin. And it's a different set of obligations. And the obligation to the Constitution, to Congress, to the truth, to our countrymen, and to the lives on all sides here that are at risk should make people willing to risk their careers.
Yes, and the legality of this war at this time, or this undeclared war, of course, was defeated in the recent U.S. congressional vote, which was a tie, which means defeat, 213 to 213. There is a Michael Ratner, an attorney in New York City, with the Constitutional Institute of Rights. And he's proceeding now to formulate a lawsuit with Jules Lobel of the University of Pittsburgh. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that, many people thought that in the Cold War and the nuclear era, the Constitution was obsolete, essentially, and that the congressional responsibility to declare war, which really meant not just a formal obligation, not just a formal declaration, but to decide whether we went to war or not. That's what our founders clearly had in mind. Was theirs alone. The Constitution doesn't say that they share that with the President, or that the President should consult with them on it. The Constitution says that is the decision for Congress, not for the President. And that was very clearly their intent. Well, many people thought, well, that's obsolete. We've got to really put this power in the hands of the President in the new era. And Congress itself was not unhappy to allow that responsibility to shift from their shoulders, which was just the kind of thing that the founders feared. I think that's why they wrote the Constitution as they did. What Vietnam showed me, and a lot of others, was that the Constitution was well written the first time. And it didn't call for an amendment changing the war powers' responsibility, but on the contrary, it was very wise to rest that power of decision of war or peace in the hands of a large representative body of people rather than one man, whether or not he was elected. And that's the way it should be. There are people who remember that, especially after Vietnam. In fact, I think even McCain is to be counted among them. And I think this recent vote does remove any shred of constitutional legitimacy from what the President is doing. And of course, the White House was very shocked by it. And for that reason, urged strongly that the Senate not go to a similar vote. And that's where, as I say, I'm agreeing with McCain. They are wrong to avoid that responsibility. But, and they certainly would be wrong, I think, to give the President the blank check that he would like to have. So we should be using, as Americans, every constitutional avenue open to us to rein in an executive branch that is once again, as so often in the past, out of control and usurping its powers in the most deadly of ways to get us into an unnecessary and wrongful war.
Yes, I'm reading here from a release from Jules Lobel, who is professor of constitutional and international law at the University of Pittsburgh. And in here, he states that the Constitution grants Congress the sole power to declare war. It must give its affirmative assent. It did not do so. Contrary to the President's statement that he will continue this war, he has no authority to do so. It would be a remarkable act of executive purpose and illegal as well to continue the bombing. It is a serious subversion of our constitutional structure, and here's a statement that I think we must listen to loud and clear, and is impeachable.
Oh, I would say that's certainly true. I believe that Lyndon Johnson committed, without any question, impeachable offenses, as for that matter, did Kennedy before him in his deception about policies in Vietnam, and certainly Nixon. I think they were all impeachable had the truth been known at the time while they were in office. Unfortunately, we didn't have the Pentagon Papers for Nixon's term in office while he was in. And unfortunately, I would have to say I released the Pentagon Papers on the Johnson and Kennedy administrations after they were out of office. I wish I had done it earlier. Had I done so, I don't have any doubt that you'd have the most challenging possible basis for removing a president from office for unconstitutional and illegal actions in the field of war and peace, foreign affairs. Now, the public at large, our actual practice has suggested that extreme reluctance by Congress and by the public to think of impeaching a president on a matter of foreign affairs. Even when they were in pursuing impeachment process against Nixon, there was a count of impeachment on his lies and aggressive bombing of Cambodia in particular. But they shied away from reporting out that article of impeachment. They didn't do their duty on that one. And they kind of left a precedent, although the record was very clear on that one. They kind of left a record that a president is not subject to impeachment on a matter of foreign policy. Well, I would like that precedent to be overturned. And I would be very happy to see this president or any other who has committed, let's say, an impeachable offense in this area, in technical terms, brought up on it. God knows it's a far more serious matter than any that President Clinton was facing earlier this year.
Yes,
no comparison.
Yes, we've just gone through the impeachment over alleged sexual misconduct.
Yeah, that has an element of absurdity to it.
Exactly, where this has reality.
Whereas this is absolutely, I wouldn't care who brought it, whether it was a Republican or Democrat, and whether it was a Republican or Democratic president. I would hope I would be very consistent on this point. I think I have been. So, in this case, there's little question in my mind that the president has been defying the Constitution, that we are in a war, as even he says, and that it was not for him, without vote of Congress, to get us into that. Now, granted, he did have a Senate vote approving the bombing at one point, which does give him a basis for saying that it wasn't a declaration of war, it wasn't as clear as it could be, but it goes pretty far toward implicating the Senate, at least, in what he's doing right now. But when it comes to, and I'm not sure what Ratner or Lobel would say about that point, by the way. They certainly did not give him a license for expanding the war to ground action. And moreover, there is the question of the 60-day limit on the War Powers Act, which is just about ready to expire if it hasn't expired already.
Right.
So new issues are raised by that.
Right, you're absolutely right, Dan. And since the initial vote, which did give him approval, and I believe that vote was 434 to 1.
Wait, wasn't it a Senate vote? We're talking about a Senate vote.
I was speaking of the one where Representative Barbara Lee, that replaced Ron Dellum, was the only...
that was for supporting the troops, I think.
For the troops,
that was
right.
After the fact. The
Right.
Senate vote was before the bombing. The other vote was to approve the bombing but especially to support the troops and so forth. And she very bravely said, I'm not going to support this measure even though I will be accused of not supporting the troops. She said that's absurd. You don't support troops by sending them into a hopeless and wrongful war.
Right. But now this recent vote, though, which comes after the initial vote that approved our actions there, the 213 to 213, clearly opens the door and mandates that every action that's now happening with U.S. forces there allied with the NATO allies in this is totally illegal as of the moment of that vote.
Frankly, I don't know enough about the constitutional law here to judge their argument on this.
Yes.
It does seem to imply that the president would, having once been authorized, which the Senate vote may have done for the
Foreign Powers Act.
For the bombing. Does he need a vote from the House as well? I'd have to know more about that. I don't know the answer to that. Does he need a kind of continuing approval by the House? Again, I'm not sure they can just turn it off that easily by a vote once it's started. Certainly they did not give, nobody gave authorization for ground bombing. And to be sure, the president so far is not calling for ground bombing, but I'm afraid that if he maintains these objectives, he will be under increasing pressure to win a victory.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
it will be increasingly obvious that he cannot achieve them with the air attack alone.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And of course, we know that recently this same Congress that failed to now support our involvement there has voted an additional $13 billion for the effort. That's kind of a contradiction there.
Well, the Congress is not behaving wonderfully on this by any means. For one thing, the vote, the $13 billion is of course just their chance to vote their constituents a lot of pork, military pork, the usual pork barrel subsidy, basically, to military industries in their states. So they're happy to do that for any excuse. If he ended the war, they would be happy to double the appropriation again if they could find a rationale for it. So, as for they're not supporting the air war on the one hand, but not calling for the air war to stop on the other. They can be accused, as McCain has accused them, of incoherence on this and cowardliness and shirking their responsibilities to take a stand. A more sympathetic interpretation at this moment could be that they are confused, because certainly this is a confusing situation from the beginning. The evils that we're facing of a very savage counterinsurgency campaign by the Serbs did seem to does raise the question of doing something about it.
Right.
And we were told by our leaders, and not only the U.S., but by in this case, multilateral force, NATO, even though not the UN, that they all agreed that this was the only thing that could be done. And I think it's understandable that people would go along with that to some degree. But the longer that they look at the evils that we are committing in what we're doing, and the more they look ahead to how much worse it can get for the people of that area and for the evils that we ourselves commit, I think the less excusable it gets to be day by day and week by week to allow this to go on. So I hope that the pressure for a negotiated solution does rise in the public and is expressed on Congress. I don't think we can leave it to our executive leaders to see that it is unacceptable to prolong the war just to save their face. They can do that a long time. They can, like any leaders, they're willing to see a war go on indefinitely at whatever human cost to avoid admitting their own error.
And we saw that. That's like the déjà vu of Vietnam.
It's Vietnam, but it's an awful lot of other wars. Korea went on a lot longer than it should have. But the classic example is World War I, where the stalemate was on the Western Front was reached inexorably in about 1 month to 2 months. And 4 years of most horrific war went on.
The war that was supposed to
Yeah,
end all wars.
yeah, went on because the leaders could not, on either side, could not bring themselves to compromise or to negotiate a solution. And they just banged up against each other indefinitely. Well, for 4 years, till one side finally collapsed. In this case, how long could we bomb Vietnam to avoid admitting error in the beginning here? We bombed Vietnam for 8 years, 7.5 years, and every month of that was in error.
Yes, and 3 million Vietnamese died.
Yeah.
3 million.
So I come back finally to this point. I think you're right to say the predominant criterion then should have been the welfare of the people of that area where we were fighting, and that it was just wrong from every point of view for the United States to be essentially prolonging a war that we knew internally, our government, that the majority of the people wanted that war over. But and we were fighting it on their countryside and to their deaths. Of course, they died, more than
58,000 in ratio to 3 million.
3 million.
Right.
But in this case, again, we would be, I think people are saying, some are saying we should not do an invasion because it would mean hundreds or 1,000 or 2,000 American casualties. Well, deaths. That would be, or NATO deaths. That would be bad. They wouldn't be justified. But that is totally outweighed, in my opinion, by the question of the Albanian and Serbian deaths that would be caused in the course of this.
Civilian deaths, collateral deaths.
Even putting aside the Serb, which I think should not be ignored, but even putting those aside, the people we should be trying to protect, claim are trying to protect, would, I think, in the event of an American invasion, die in numbers more than 10 times the American casualties. It might be many more than that. Hundreds of thousands, I believe, would die, both at the hands of the Serbs, who I do not think would allow Albanian males to leave the country, as many of them have so far, to join the KLA. I think they would be slaughtered in large numbers. And even larger number would probably be slaughtered by our own forces, thanks to the ruthless tactics of the other side, in addition to the people who were simply, in the old expression, caught in the crossfire, collateral damage. So one way or another, it would be a final solution for the Albanian Muslims, the Albanian Kosovars, if we were to invade, and we would be the executioners of the greater part of that number. That, I think, is the overwhelming reason for ruling out such a tactic. And if you rule out ground invasion, alongside the obvious hopelessness of the air attack, you realize that we have no military option.
Well, recently we've heard the calling up of 33,000 U.S. reservists.
Well, if we go to an invasion, it'll be a lot more than that.
And today, I don't know if you're aware of this, Dan, but I saw the staging and the setting up of this display on the Mall, which is an area for those people listening around the world. It's a large park area that stretches from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial. There's a display of military armaments down there, jets, tanks, missile launchers, Minuteman missile launchers, and along with these displays, and by the way, this event opens today.
What's
well,
that?
there's tractor-trailer truck down there, the Army recruiting tractor-trailer trucks, and Navy recruiters are down there. And of course, we have hundreds of thousands of high school graduates that are now coming through Washington to see the sights of Washington, and it seems that the military is deliberately and purposely staged this event so these young youth will be possibly swayed by the magnetism of these machines of death and whatnot and sign up to have these forces available for ground action.
It's one thing, and I would say obscene, but it's one thing to try to recruit people before the invasion takes place. But I feel pretty confident this war will not be a big recruiting opportunity, will not provide a lot of recruiting opportunity or motivation have to, because it will be a very dirty, costly war. The effects on civilians will be horrendous, and the outcome will not be any kind of clean, rewarding victory for the United States, but rather an endless guerrilla war against people who see themselves as fighting for their own country, Serbia, in which they include Kosovo, and where they'll fight for a very long time as guerrillas. So it will not be a gratifying war, and it will not. If we make this terrible error, in addition to the ones we've already made, of going to full-scale ground war against Serbia or Kosovo, it will not swell recruiting ranks in later years.
Is there anything else you can think of?
No, I'm covered pretty much. I could get longer. Couldn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to just close with a quote here of General Omar Bradley from the United States Forces World War II. Direct quote of General Omar Bradley states, "Wars can be prevented just as surely as they can be provoked. And we, who fail to prevent them, must share in the guilt for the dead." And I think this afternoon, with our conversation and the words of Dan Ellsberg, that Dan Ellsberg is certainly one that is speaking out to prevent further bloodshed, not only in this war, but he certainly did during Vietnam. And I'm sure that Dan, who is a member of Veterans for Peace, as I am, share with our membership that we hope for all people on all sides to lay down their arms, to say a farewell to arms, that we'll have no more bells that toll over the grave sites, but rather that we can join with all peoples in forgiveness and healing, as we must surely do. And we must always remember that truth is the first casualty of war. We must also remember that peace is very patriotic, and that we must give our grandchildren a better world than we now are showing them. I will say that during the recent elections in 1995, the Democratic candidates here, then President William Jefferson Clinton, his Vice President Al Gore, they campaigned to the American people, and they told us that they were going to build this wondrous bridge into the 21st century. I share with this to the people of the world. If this is the bridge that they're building to the 21st century, I do not want to cross that bridge. I refuse to ride across in a motor vehicle, a bicycle, or a skateboard. I would rather swim or crawl across the raging waters below in the rivers than cross this bridge that they're now constructing into the 21st century. Thank you very much, Dan.